the integration of learning to experience the love of Jesus as it's attached to our sexual desires. What is it I'm desiring that's beneath my desire? So what is it? I always ask yourself that question. What's the desire beneath my desire? And for me, what came to the light was, what am I looking for from women, from sex, from porn, from fantasy? It was approval, it was validation, it was acceptance, and these are wounds of mine.
This is the Made to Advance podcast. I'm your host, Brian Aulick. We're here to inspire and equip you for your best future. Well, hey everybody, welcome to Made to Advance. It is so good to be with you today. And before we get started, I just want to ask you a favor. If you have appreciated our podcast, please rate and review us. That helps us get the word out about our show. And it also helps us bring on more great guests. Today we have with us Noah Filipiak, and he is part of Mosaic Church. He's actually the lead pastor of Mosaic Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He's the author of Beyond the Battle, A Man's Guide to His Identity in Christ in an Oversexualized World. And he also wrote Needed Navigation, a teen's guide to his or her identity in Christ in a sex and porn-filled world. I think Noah likes long subtitles. He hosts a podcast called The Flip Side. He also runs some online sexual sin recovery groups. We're going to put links to all of Noah's work in the show notes. But Noah, welcome to Made to Advance.
Hey, thanks, Brian. I know if I get a third book published, I'm going to have to stop listing my subtitles in my bio, and that's kind of sad.
Well, I was really going to be trying hard to nail the subtitles, and I still choked on the one of them there. So
I can't remember my own subtitle to Needed Navigation. I have to look it up every time, so don't worry about it.
Well, the good news is once you read your title and subtitle, there is no confusion on what the book is about. You're like, okay, I know what I'm getting myself into.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's really good having you on. It's funny because what our listeners don't know is we've actually had this is like our take two, because the first time we jumped on, all of a sudden we had internet issues here in our studio.
It was not meant to be.
It was not. You patiently endured. And then finally we just threw in the towel and said, hey, let's do this on another day. But thanks for your grace. I appreciate that.
The pressure's on. This is the day. We're going to get it perfect today. So,
you know, it's funny, and I mentioned this to you before, but why the part of why I was so excited to have you on is because we had our men's conference about a year ago at this time, and you were one of our workshops that we had, and by far the most number of guys went to your particular workshop, and it just showed me, and I don't think it's any big surprise, but some of the topics that you really specialize in talking about, really rung true with, we had more than 400 guys that were at that conference, and then to have I don't want to say the majority, but the largest group of all the workshops attend, said, hey, this is an important area. Not surprising, but also really reinforced for me. Let's do some more work here. So I'm glad you're on.
Yeah, thanks. No, it's a good reminder, I think, for all of us. For whatever reason, we, as pastors in churches, we get into this lull, like, I don't know, I think there's different reasons for it, but we just start to think people aren't struggling with this. Men and women, teen guys, teen girls aren't struggling with this. And so, or like if we don't talk about it, maybe it'll just go away kind of thing. And so, yeah, I think it's always really refreshing, and it's really affirming for me of doing this work where, just we start to shine the light on some things and people start to be vulnerable, and you go, oh, wow, this is way more prevalent, than I thought. Yeah. And the statistics show that, but I think we think, we're the exception to the rule. But once you get a few people that start to be vulnerable, and then you start to go, and I think that's the tipping point that Satan doesn't want. Satan doesn't want us to be vulnerable because he wants every individual listening right now to think you're the only one that struggles. And when I say struggle, I mean it could be porn, it could be lust, it could be fantasy, it could be discontentment in your marriage, discontentment in your singleness, whatever it may be. Satan wants you to think you're the only one that struggles. And the fact is, we're all struggling in one way or the other. And once we start to be vulnerable, man, I've seen some amazing just grace encounters happen in those moments, and some amazing healing happen. So anyway, back to Engedi. There's Beyond the Battle groups being run at Engedi right now, which is awesome. So I'm super pumped about that. I'm pumped to come back in February for the men's conference again. And so, yeah, I'm praising God for what he's doing at your church. So
thank you.
Thanks for doing that.
Well, you know, what you're kind of, besides being a pastor, having this area of ministry is very much like a specialty focus for you. How did you ever develop this passion for getting into kind of the sexual recovery space? I mean, where did this come from?
Yeah, it just comes out of my own testimony. It's funny, when I was 21 and I graduated college a year early, got my first job as a youth pastor at a small church, and they asked me to share my testimony in church. I was like, that's cool, that's fine. I was saved at a really young age, raised in a Christian home, but I shared my testimony of what I've overcome in Christ, and I talked about my story of overcoming pornography. It was pretty brief, and I remember after sharing that at 21, several people coming up to me and going, wow, I have never heard anyone be so vulnerable, you know, in a testimony before. Or I've never heard anyone talk about that before in a testimony. Thank you, you know, thanking me for sharing. And I was polite, you know, and, you know, you're welcome and things. But internally at that young age, I started to realize there's a real problem in the church if this is the first time anyone's heard anyone talk about this in this way, and they're sort of shocked. And I'm going, man, I know, trust me, I am not the only guy struggling with porn, let alone women that are struggling. And I remember, just without looking at any statistics, when I was at Christian college, we did a small group through a book on pornography, and many of us were studying to become pastors. And in the dorm, there were 20 of us that showed up for this group that my roommate and I were leading. 19 out of 20 guys, you know, on day one, we shared our testimonies, were struggling with pornography. That's a pretty high statistic, you know, and I just know that's not going anywhere. Like, that isn't. So for me, where it came from was just my own testimony and being a pastor. I mean, I'm just a pastor. And so I would preach on this. And every time I would preach on it, I would have guys come up to me and say, hey, I need help. You know, do you have a book for me, a resource for me? I'm not bashing all the books that were out there back then. I can say there's a lot better resources today than there were 20 years ago, a lot better. Some of the books from when I was in college did a lot of harm to me once I got married, and we can talk about some of that. They gave me a lot of entitlement. They treated sex like it was my prize because I did it God's way, and now I was entitled to sex in my marriage, and that almost ended my marriage. So that's part of my story too.
Wow.
And I wasn't going to refer them to those books. And so, you know, one thing led to another, and I ended up writing Beyond the Battle as a compilation of my story, you know, the sermons I'd already been giving, and that's how it came about. And then from there, it's just being open-handed to what God wants to do with it. And I love writing. I mean, the calling to be an author has been refined over the years as well, and it's something I want to continue doing. So yeah, that's how I got here doing
that's really
pastoring
cool.
and this. Yeah.
When did Beyond the Battle first kind of hit the stand, so to speak?
I wrote the very first manuscript 2012, so that was quite a while ago. And then I was pursuing publishing in 15 through 17 with an agent, was not able to get published, and I had people waiting on the book. And this is sort of another side story, but just of, you know, ministry versus publishing. And I was like, this isn't getting published, and publishers liked it. It just never got over the hump. And so I self-published it because I had people waiting for ministry. Like, I had guys waiting for groups. I had people that knew it was coming. And so that was a really good experience because it gave me 2 years with starting these groups and working through the book. And then it was in 2020 that I reconnected with Zondervan and then was able to publish an updated version of the original book. And that came out in 2021. What a cool opportunity that was to have 2 years of going through the book with dozens and dozens and dozens of guys and seeing the gaps in the book and where it could be better. And just, I want to help guys. I mean, let's make this thing better and stronger. And in my own story shifted and changed. And some of the new stuff in there is reflective of maybe some of the blind spots I had the first time. So it's a pretty cool story to get to have with a book.
Well, that's a great takeaway in general, because you've got the plan where you think, hey, let's get it published, let's move forward, and you've got your hopes and dreams on that side of things. But then to be that patient with the process, ultimately self-publishing, I'm guessing now you're like, oh, okay, maybe God kind of had a hand in this whole journey as far as when it finally got picked up by Zondervan. I mean, it sounds like it was a better probably a considerably better book than what it would have been if it would have been released years prior. It's a good word to anybody out there who's like sitting on a dream right now and going, come on, why isn't this happening and all that? Yeah. And you just, the problem is you never know what God's up to in the waiting time. It's just only on the backside, do you go, but it's a good word for patience.
And again, there's so many layers to this, but I like, your podcast is kind of like mine where we're talking about just all discipleship here, right? And so I can just throw a quick thing in on that. I mean, in 2018, wanting so bad to get published, it was a real identity issue for me of feeling really crushed every time a publisher was interested and then said no. And I was putting so much of my validation in this, I want to be published. And God had to humble me in that as I had guys waiting for this book. And I'm a pastor. I mean, I just want to minister to people. And I had to go, I'm delaying ministry to guys that need it because I want this sort of validation of being officially published. I felt a ton of soul freedom, self-publishing. I'm not knocking any individual in the publishing industry, but it is a industry, and you have to promote yourself. And there's just certain things about that weren't healthy for my soul. And I loved having this self-published book and just being free to do ministry. And we had the groups going, and they were doing well. And I was doing some work with Covenant Eyes and all this. And it wasn't until 2 years later, there were 3 particular guys that I dedicated the new book to, and they just bothered me enough. Like, what's the word? Like, they annoyed me enough with their persistence. Yeah. They kept saying, you need to get this traditionally published. It's like so good, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't want to. It was a reversal of heart from in 2018. I needed it. Like, this had to validate me to like, I'm really at peace with where I am. I do not want to go back into that. And, they bugged me enough about it that I said, okay, I have this one person's email still. I will email them. They're going to say no. And then next thing you knew, it got published. So that's kind of a
great.
Cool story too.
That's a really cool
part
story.
Of it. Yeah.
I'm curious, and we'll get to the kind of the subject at hand in a minute, but I'm curious, having then self-published for several years and gotten it out in guys' hands, and then being, published by a main house like Zondervan, were you, after now having looked back on, getting published and all that, are you like, yeah, this was really worth it, I'm glad I did that? What did it bring to the table to have Zondervan behind you? Has that been a real positive thing? Or are you like, nah, it's been kind of more of the same? What difference has it made?
Yeah, I think for sure we all think this way. I do too. I mean, there's a vetting process that goes into being traditionally published. And so it definitely gets your foot in the door. There's a level maybe of respectability to it. But I just want to say too, there's a lot of self-published works out there that are better than stuff that's getting published. And we just have to be honest about that. So if you're a reader or a pastor, don't throw out something just because it's not traditionally published, because the way the industry is, I was really lucky to get published. I mean, that's a whole nother story, but I don't want to say lucky, but I didn't check all the boxes that which is why I couldn't get published the first time. But yeah, it certainly helps. It certainly helps with opening up some new opportunities in things like that. But then again, with Needed Navigation, I had a book I wanted to write for teens. I had teens waiting for it. I had parents waiting for it. It's a 70-page book, and I just didn't really want to go through the hassle. It's not like Beyond the Battles on the New York Times best-selling list where I can just like walk into a publishing house and say, yo, I'm here, where's my contract? Yeah. And I just did not want to go through all that again. I will pursue traditional publishing again. In fact, I have a devotional book coming out with Our Daily Bread's publishing house next year, which is awesome, and again, a blessing. But Needed Navigation was like, yo, this is going to be just as good self-published as it is traditional, and I really want to get this in the hands of teens like yesterday. And so it worked out beautifully. So there's benefit to both, but yeah, I mean, I'm not going to lie. Having a traditional publishing, whatever you'd call that, on your credential, I mean, Our Daily Bread probably wouldn't have received my proposal had I not had that already with Zondervan.
Yeah, just has some weight to it. That's cool. I love that. Hearing that journey behind the scenes is really cool. Well, let's spend a minute. Just if you were to just really define the landscape in this whole kind of space of sexual temptation, sexual sin today, I see stats come out all the time on, this many people are dealing with this and all, give me a sense for what you would say. What's the state of affairs these days when it comes to this particular area?
Yeah, I think this is one area where we do need to pay attention to the stats, and I would say they're true as far as my experience anecdotally as well. Some stats that stand out: the average age of first exposure to porn, one study said 12 years old. Another study said it was 9 for boys and 11 for girls. And so that's something where, for all of us, but particularly my Needed Navigation book, it's like if you're a parent, you got to understand those stats are not made up. The average age of first exposure to pornography is 9 for boys and 11 for girls. This is something we have to be talking to our kids about. And one of my passions, Brian, is for churches and parents and pastors and youth pastors to normalize the conversation. We have to normalize it. We all think, oh, if we talk about that in a sermon series or that, I don't know, will people leave our church? Will they this? Will they that? No, they will be drawn to you. Like people are thirsty for this message. It will be your number one listened to message on your YouTube or your podcast. I mean, people, this is what they're looking for. A couple other stats that stand out. With teens today, 90% of teens are either encouraging, accepting, or neutral when they talk about porn with their friends. And so I feel like when I was a teen, my non-Christian friends were talking about porn, but in the church, it still was pretty taboo. It was kind of behind the scenes. And I think that's changing because it's so widespread because of the, smartphones and other reasons that it's teens' views of it are changing. It's becoming more normal for teens. If you go down the stat line, and I do this in Needed Navigation, there's a huge number of teens that are looking to porn as their sex ed. So I think it's around half teens. They're basically learning about sex from porn. They believe the things they're seeing are real. And then the stats are off the charts for the number of rape scenes that are in porn. One study I think showed it was in the 80s percentage-wise for abuse and rape that was in porn. And then you have teens that are saying on these surveys, I believe what I'm seeing in porn is real life, and I'm going to try that. So that's another huge problem. But back to your question, it's just the pervasiveness of it. It says, one study showed that 91% of men and 60% of women, this is wild. So now again, this is photo, video, or written porn, so that kind of broadens the category a little bit. But 91% of men and 60% of women said they've consumed porn in the past month. Wow. And so that's really, really high. Like in the past month, that's really, really high. And then one last one for teens. Again, these studies are just studying, different groups, different ages. So there's going to be little differences throughout all of them. But ages 13 through 17, 7 in 10, this is male and female teens, 7 out of 10 teenagers have viewed porn in the past week. And so you're just this is real, right? This is, if you look at a group of high schoolers at your church, at the local high school. I just spoke at a local high school here in Grand Rapids, and I spoke on porn, and the teens were glued to my words. I had teens brave enough to come talk to me afterwards. And my sadness is, where do I turn them to? I can give them the book, read the book. I said, get some friends together. That's why I wrote the book, because teens are drowning, and a lot of them want help. When I was a teen, that's my story, addicted to porn as a Christian teen, nobody was reaching out to save me from drowning. I just drowned. This is an opportunity for us to reach out to our teens to save them from drowning. And then on the adult side, that's why we have the Beyond the Battle groups. So it's not just, hey, here's a book, go read it with some friends. It's join a group, we'll lead you, we'll guide you, and then we're going to put you into this alumni community, which is free and it's indefinite, and it's just lifelong support. And it's discipleship. I'm telling you, it's support and discipleship and vulnerability. So that's why we do those groups. And a quick shout out to sherecovery.com for women. There's women's groups as well around porn and unwanted sexual sin.
Man, that's really, really cool. When you think of coming alongside younger people in particular, I think one of the tensions that parents feel is if they don't know their kid is struggling already. I think a lot of us as parents were reactive. We find out, oh no, our kid's been exposed, and now it's time to have conversations and books and all these different all this. And part of it is because I think you don't want to, in a sense, introduce this whole subject of, hey, there's this thing out there called porn, and start getting your kid spun up on what? Oh man, that because just all of us have a sin nature, so just hearing about something that's not good can awaken a desire for something. How do you navigate that tension? Like when would you say a parent should be starting that conversation with their child about porn? And yeah, I mean, is there a risk of we're going to end up awakening something? I'm guessing you're going to say, actually, maybe there is, maybe there isn't, but the downside risk of not processing it is way worse than. So anyway, yeah, you field the question however you want.
No, that's a fair question. It's a very real question for parents. And look, I'm a parent. I have 3 kids. I have 3 daughters. My oldest will be 13 next month, and so I think about all these things as well. And the fact of the matter is, if you don't talk to your kids about porn, or the church doesn't talk to your kids about porn, they will be talking about porn. They will be talking about it at school with their friends, guys and girls. If they're playing, particularly with guys, playing on a sports team, anywhere you go, there is going to be so much conversation around porn. And for girls, like with my daughter, it's more like she knows guys are talking about porn. She knows it's out there. They already know it's out there. So I want to be really respectful of parents asking that, because it's a really, really fair question. But I would say, just forgive me for using kind of maybe, I don't mean for this to be harsh at all, but it's kind of naive. It's naive to think that like somehow they would never find it. And so you want them to learn about it from you first and have their view of sex and porn shaped first by you as a parent, by your youth pastor, by your church, by books like these, so that when it comes, they're ready for it. One stat along this line, 93% of boys see porn before they turn 18. 62% of girls see porn before they turn 18. And so they're going to see it. The other thing is, like with my daughter, it is different with guys and girls. And girls are struggling with porn, absolutely. Like I said, the stats are really high. I think if I had a son, I would know that he is pretty much bound to fall into porn at one point. Like, I think in some ways we have to, how do I want to say this? Kind of have to expect it, and need a navigation guides both a parent and a teen through that. Certainly hope it doesn't happen. I mean, there's rare cases. There is, but it's probably, in my experience, like maybe 1 in 50 guys, like men who didn't fall into it or come across it. So that's not going to be your kid. Like the chances of that, and it's just less and less. So it's more, okay, when it happens, you can talk to me. I'm a safe person. I don't think you say it that way to your kid, but like for my daughter, for example, I think it's a bit different. And I could be naive on this too, right? Like I'm not saying in any way that maybe my daughter couldn't get hooked or something. The drive is different. I've not done a deep study on women in porn. I just know the stats are high. 1/3 of all users at the largest porn site on the internet are women, which is crazy. Wow, if you think about that's active, right? So with my daughter, though, she's going to be 13 next month. So I'm going back to your question, Brian. It's a great question. Like, my daughter's going to be 13. She's not a porn addict. I'm going to have her read Need a Navigation when she turns 13. I'm going to read it with her. Okay. It's a book from very specifically for teen guys and girls. It's written for both. It's approachable. It's not in your face. And it's meant to normalize the conversation. I want the conversation to be normalized for her, so she knows she can always talk to me and my wife about pornography, about sex. Because when we don't talk about it, then we make shame. We turn it into a shame-based thing. Why haven't we talked about this? It must be really naughty. It must be really bad. But I'm looking at it, or I want to look at it, or whatever it may be. So the risk on the side of not talking about it is way higher, I would say, than the risk of talking about it. And if you do it in a gentle way, Need a Navigation starts with, here's why porn is wrong. Like with the teens, I do that because of that stat. 90% think it's neutral or okay. It's it lays it out for them. So at least there's a baseline they have of, okay, I have some motivation, to not look at this. But yeah, I absolutely think we need to be talking about it in age-appropriate ways. I think you can talk to your 10-year-old about it, your 7-year-old about it, maybe about sex in general. Not that there's porn out there, but look, they're getting Chromebooks in fourth grade, third grade, and so you got to start talking about. And I'll say this and stop land the plane on this answer, but there's a lot of other bad stuff online too, right? And so you need to be telling your kids about online safety, child predators that are online, about just phishing scams for kids. There's lots of things online that they need to be aware of.
Yeah.
One of them is this. I haven't read this book. This was in a recent interview I did or heard. I'm sorry. I think the book's called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, but it was a book recommended that you can like talk to your kid about. It just talks through what is there online. So I think all that is really good. And I think most kids at a young age are pretty receptive to that of like, okay, this, yeah. So I'll stop there, but I think it's really important that we're...
It's cool. What I hear you saying is, number one, even with your book, taking them through the book in advance of a struggle, not in response to a struggle, though you could obviously do that as well, I'm sure. Would you say you would take, if you had a son, would you take him through it earlier than your daughter? She's 13. Would you say, maybe I would take the son through at 11? Or do you go, no, 13 feels like about the right age for that book?
I feel like I wrote it for 13 through, teen, 13 through 19. I think the exception is like in Michigan, middle school, 6th through 8th grade. Where I grew up, it was 7th and 8th grade. I do think there's a difference there for 6th graders. I mean, they are being exposed to stuff. They're on the middle school bus, I mean, they're going to be exposed to stuff that 8th graders are getting into. So I think it depends on your kid. If a boy is hitting puberty earlier, then I would go earlier. And I think you can read it as a parent and kind of discern some of that. But I think for both, by the time they hit 13, because Needed Navigation in particular, it's talking a lot about sex and God's design for sex and some of the changes that are happening in your body and taking the shame away. I think that's a big thing. Boys and girls talking about, 10, 11, 12-year-olds into 13 and 14 as they hit puberty. There's a lot of shame around that stuff, your body changing and what's happening. And again, if we don't talk about it, the shame just gets worse. And so I think by 13, I'd say you should be with both. And for sure, I think you could go a little younger if probably no earlier than 6th grade, though. Mm-hmm.
Well, I love that you're starting out the book with laying out the case of why porn is not a good thing. And you probably saw these too. I just saw, I think the most probably recent work on, like research-wise, on people's acceptance of porn, and it was shocking. It said, here's the general culture's view on porn, and then it said, here are folks who would identify as evangelical Christians' view on porn, adults and kids. And I just was blown away at the percentage of people that said either A, they were neutral on it, or B, they thought, no, this can be a good thing. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what world are we living in? But in some ways, when it comes to the whole subject of sexuality, we are living in a crazy world, and we have to go back to just fundamental. Like, it's almost like with sexuality, we can't assume anything about anybody's beliefs or baseline expectations. You think, well, of course, everybody understands X, Y, or Z. No. In this culture, it feels like we have to go back to the absolute beginning of the beginning and start explaining kind of God's view of sexuality and whatnot. We started talking with our kids about, it's funny because the schools here, I think it's in 5th grade that they start having some conversations around sexual stuff. It's real appropriate. We went to a meeting of some sort where they said, here's what we're going to cover, and they went through it, and I honestly expected it to be a little spicier than it was. But what was cool is I think we had always intended to really have intentional conversations with our kids, but I will say, I know people have different feelings about the schools getting into these matters, but it really prompted us to say, okay, we want to lead this conversation, not follow it. So that really, for us, began a journey of always getting ahead of schools on going in deep places. And our kids, we've had I know it's so awkward, moms and dads, if you're listening right now, I know it's so awkward, and the stats are just, last time I read them, terrible of when it comes to parents having these conversations, but we pushed into the awkward spaces, and we've had some incredible conversations with our kids on these matters. Have you been like surprised at how much your 13-year-old, for example, was willing to engage, or is it like, no, I've got enough experience that she, she kind of engaged the way I expected? Because I was shocked. Like even to this day, we have incredibly transparent conversations.
Yeah, and I think if parents are listening that have kids 10, 11, 12, 13, you're ahead of the game if you're able to start at that age. I think where there's still, at least for my kids, pretty impressionable, respect mom and dad, kind of if we say something's dangerous, they listen, things like that. If you haven't had that conversation and your kid's 16 or 17, I think it's going to be harder probably to, depending on that relationship, that parent versus teen relationship. But Yeah, I mean, my daughter, they just did the sex ed, kind of program at school was, and it was, she felt uncomfortable, but she was telling us about it. And I think the best thing you can do as a parent is say, I want you to be able to talk to me about anything. I want you to be able to talk to me about anything. And to get rid of that, maybe that old mindset of, if you did something wrong, I'm going to punish you. I'm going to shame you. If your kid is preemptively coming to you and wanting to talk to you and maybe even confessing something, praise God for that. That is so awesome. Even if you catch your kid, I know this is a different question, but if you catch your kid looking at pornography, just go easy on them, understand shame. And there's probably some sort of addiction level going on at that point if you're catching them. The approach is, I just don't think the approach is to shame them, punish them. It's only going to make them more scared to talk to you. So yeah, it's gone really well with my kids and having these conversations. And there are some good resources out there for this for Christian families. If you want a little leg up, I just interviewed. Let me make sure I get the exact name correctly here. Sex Ed Reclaimed. There's a Christian curriculum out there for parents. It's designed for, schools, homeschools, churches, families, but it's very good. And so Kristen Mealy is the director of that, and just a shout out to her because for some parents, they have no idea how to talk to their kids about this. And so it's just a curriculum you can go through and pick the subjects you want. It's
that's cool.
Age-based. There's stuff for little kids. There's stuff for teenagers. So yeah, I just think, and again, that helps too with normalizing the conversation so that when churches, I would love to see churches be less afraid to talk about this from the stage because everyone's already dealing with it. We just need to normalize conversation. And I think it's the same in families as well.
How do you navigate the tension when let's say a child, you find that your child has looked at porn? I know a lot of parents have had this experience where on the one hand, they know it's possible, they even know it's likely, but all of a sudden the day comes where they actually hear about it and they catch their kid and they're like, oh my goodness, and all that. And on the one hand, totally agree with you that you really want to set yourself up for an ongoing healthy conversation with them around this. So the moment you get super punitive and, all that, you're starting to do things that are going to, I think, set back that relationship that you want to have over the long haul. That being said, you also want to go, okay, where do we need to make some changes?
Absolutely.
That could help you? That may feel punitive, and I'm thinking specifically of things like internet access. I don't know if you're a fan of Covenant Eyes, but something like Covenant Eyes or other kinds of applications that help you screen your internet. So I'd be curious, number one, if you see your kids dealing with some stuff, maybe preemptively or reactively, what kinds of steps do you take, and how do you do that without them feeling like, wow, they just lowered the boom on me on this thing?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that as a follow-up. So when I refer to, punishing your kids, I'm talking about screaming at them, how could you do that? You're dirty, you're this, girl, or whatever. Absolutely. Our goal is not to have our kids looking at pornography. And so we are really naive if we aren't preemptively as well. And again, forgive me if I said naive twice now. We as parents, I just want to be real to you as a parent. If you have especially a boy, and you have given him a phone without any type of accountability software on it, I'm pretty comfortable saying he's looking at porn from age probably 14, up. His friends are looking at porn. They're looking at and again, in my story as a teen addicted to porn, this was desktop computers back in the mid 90s and late 90s, early 2000s. As I graduated high school in 2001, I didn't want to be looking at porn. I'm not saying your teen wants to. I think there's two types of Christian teen. I think there's the Christian teen that's I think there's three types. I think there's one that says I this isn't a sin. Whatever, church is stupid, I'm going to do whatever I want. And that's one type. And I think there's a second type that goes, okay, and this is where a lot of adults are too. Okay, I know this is a sin, but I've just kind of come to accept it, kind of like you said in that stat, right? It's kind of inevitable, and so I'm not going to seek help or resist it. And there's a third type, and this is where I was as a teen, and this is where a lot of teens are. These are the teens coming up to me after I spoke at this high school, and they are convicted of their sin, they love Jesus, and they're trapped, and they're looking for help. And so, yeah, the preemptive stuff that we can do, first of all, we have to do it as parents. Even if your kids resist it, you are saving them from. I've heard many experts call porn a form of sexual abuse, and that's not to belittle or compare it necessarily to direct sexual abuse, but what it does to the brain, especially to a child or a middle schooler, adolescent, is similar to sexual abuse. And so parents, you're preventing your children in a way from a form of sexual abuse. That's really important that you do it. And so for me, I use both Covenant Eyes and Accountable to You. I hope it's okay to throw out. I have a promo code for both.
Go for it.
CovenantEyes.com, and you use promo code BEYOND. So like the title of the book, Beyond the Battle, gives you a free month. And then Accountable to You, the reason we started layering them, both for my family and for our guys in Beyond the Battle, is the softwares do two different things. I won't get into all the details of it. Needed Navigation has 2 pages that's very, very detailed. There's some nuances to iPhone, iPad that you have to do to get it to work really well on there for all your apps. But essentially, Accountable to You is checking the words that are on your screen, so searches, keywords, and Covenant Eyes is checking pictures. So Instagram, things like that don't have words to them. So I love using both. Promo for Accountable to You is a little hard to remember, but it's the letter A, the number 2, the letter U, app/beyond. And so that's what we do. And I think between the two, it's pretty comprehensive. And the addiction experts, what's that really popular book on habits? I just read it, Atomic Habits. That's really popular. It's a non-Christian book. It's just on habits and how they form. They talk about in there how one of the things they say, I'm paraphrasing roughly, is if we can just make it harder to get to our habit, we'll often stop doing it, right? And so if you can just pull out your phone and bam, one click, you're looking at something. And Brian, I want to widen my definition of porn as well for everyone. If you're on Instagram and you're looking at scantily clad, sensual pictures or videos of whether it's men or women, that's porn. My porn entry was the Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition. That's porn. If you're watching Netflix, whether it's Game of Thrones, full-on nudity, or whatever show you're watching, it's hard to find shows on Netflix that don't have nudity in them anymore. That's porn as well. And so I just want to be really clear on that so that parents know we're not just talking about like the hardcore stuff, which I think the stats is what they're talking about. I'm talking about all of it because it's the same heart issue. It's the same lust issue. It does the same thing to our brain. So my point is having Accountable to You, having Covenant Eyes on these devices, it's just really, really going to help us. It's not the full solution. I want to be clear of that. This is a heart issue, and Beyond the Battle and Needed Navigation both get to the heart, but it's an essential tool. It is an essential tool. And for me, it's like, why would I choose to not have this? Like, I'm just going to open up a door to Satan and be like, hey, the door's there. And, I'm not going to use it, but we'll just leave the door there. I'd rather just shut the door, frankly, and particularly for our kids as well.
Yeah, I think that's so good. And I remember when we first subscribed to Covenant Eyes and I looked at the price, whatever it is per month, and I thought, wow, I mean, this is definitely not free. And it's not cheap, but not that it's overly expensive. But I just remember thinking at the time, I don't know if there's going to be outside of like food and, house expenses. I don't know if there's going to be anything we spend our money on that's better than having some of these accountability mechanisms built in and protections. I'll check. It was, we'll have all this in the show notes, but I'll have to check out the other one you mentioned because I wasn't familiar with that until this conversation. Let's talk for a little bit, and obviously stuff you've written is going to be able, if people really want to dig deeper, they can pick up your books. But when you think about, for now, let's shift to more of an adult or young adult and older. What are the key things that you think a person needs to have in their life if they're going to, avoid porn and have kind of a healthy approach to sexuality, but particularly with regard to porn, they're going, man, I just want to stay in the right place. What are the key steps they need to take?
Number one, top of the list, times 1,000, is vulnerable community. And so my chapter 12 of Beyond the Battle is the one brand new chapter I added, and is my takeaways, call it takeaways and breakaways, from the first book that I wrote. And the number one point in there is isolation kills, vulnerable community brings life. And I just can't say that enough, over and over and over and over again. If you think you can do this on your own, you're wrong. But you're not alone in that. I mean, I'm not shaming you for it. Everybody thinks they can do it on their own. I think that's Satan's biggest lie to us. Vulnerable community brings life. So what does that look like? It's going to look different in different people's situations. But I think it has to be scheduled, and it has to have a routine to what is talked about. So if you have a best friend, and you talk about this stuff, that's great, but how often? And is it just when you're in trouble? I was in that spot. I was like, I talked to my best friend about this, but it was like maybe every 6 months, right? So what is needed is something scheduled and regular. Can you do that in your church? Yeah, you can. Can you do that with friends of yours? Yes, you can. But it takes a lot of initiative to make that happen, for it to be regular and scheduled. That's the main reason we started our groups. That's our beyondthebattle.net groups, is so guys could just hop in and have that ready-made. Like, here's vulnerable community, and it's regular and it's scheduled. And again, for women, sherecovery.com is the same. But that's the biggest one. And so what does that look like? It means it could look like calling a friend, talking to your pastor, talking to someone you respect, and just sharing with them that you're struggling, sharing with them your story. Just start there, and if you want, you can talk to a counselor, go one-on-one and just, it's confidential, nobody's going to find out, right? Talk to a counselor and just start there. But just sharing it, that is the number one. And I think the number two is we have to get past just kind of maybe the old idea of accountability that we just sit around in a circle and say, I did this week, and so did I, But we have to have some tools of how to actually renovate our hearts and renovate our minds. And so, some really, really good tools around that for both guys, for men and for women. And there's, like I said, there's a lot more good tools out there. So certainly,
you want to expand on tools? Any particular? Yeah, you were going to mention your book Beyond the Battle, but
Beyond the Battle for guys. A great new book that just came out for women is called Her Freedom Journey by Doctors Julie Slattery and Joy Skarka. SheRecovery.com has some great books out there as well. There's a lot of good books out there nowadays. So get yourself equipped beyond the surface level of how do we, Authentic Intimacy is another great ministry. That's Julie Slattery's ministry, Her Freedom Journey comes out of, but lots of great stuff for men and women on there, lots of great stuff for married couples on there as well, when it comes to the topic of sex. And so it's finding those resources, and there's great research that go through the psychological side of things, and there's a lot of husband material with Drew Boa is a great resource. Pure Desire is a great resource. So Samson Society is another good resource. So these resources are out there. It's the meeting vulnerably and then having these resources. And I think a third piece and finally is the integration of learning to experience the love of Jesus as it's attached to our sexual desires. So I'd say one of the main point, if not the main point of Beyond the Battle and of Needed Navigation is, what is it I'm desiring that's beneath my desire? So I always ask yourself that question. What's the desire beneath my desire? And for me, what came to the light was, what am I looking for from women, from sex, from porn, from fantasy? It was approval. It was validation, it was acceptance, and these are wounds of mine, from my life, and I was asking my wife to give me things that only Jesus could give me, and that's not fair to ask of any human. And so we have to learn how to find our acceptance, our validation, our approval in Jesus. And it's not just a Bible verse here or there. There's a discipleship pathway for that, and I think it's a lifelong pathway. So being in discipleship settings like these, where we can make those connections, and then when I'm in my solitude time with God, then when I'm in my quiet time, my prayer time, my scripture time, I'm making the connection that He's filling me up with the love I'm looking for from sex, from romance. And then back to vulnerable community, when I'm with my community, they're embodying it to me. And that's how the brain changes. We can change the pathways of our brains. We can be healed of trauma. When other people embody the love of Christ to us, we start to believe it in our bodies. Our body goes, oh, I'm actually loved. I'm actually accepted by Jesus because this person in front of me, this circle of people, they're accepting me. They're showing me grace and mercy. That's the game changer.
Yeah, well, that's a really powerful. You're reminding me of a memory I haven't thought about in a long time. But Christina and I always tried to just be really, really right from the beginning of our relationship, really transparent. But I remember a certain as we were getting closer to, I think we may have been engaged. We were still in college, and I just remembered there were a couple of things that I felt like, man, this is these are things I haven't told anybody, but I want her to know everything there is to know. And I remember telling her, and you're like scared. I mean, it's a very vulnerable thing. How is she going to react? I knew she wasn't going to, be like, oh, I'm done with this relationship or anything like that. But I mean, would she be like, oh, or would I feel, I don't know, a lot of other negative things you could feel. And her response was so good and so gracious. And we played an old song that from a Christian artist that was on the theme of grace and forgiveness. And that experience of being with her in that moment was just so powerful, of really not just kind of knowing about forgiveness and grace, but truly experiencing it, embodying it. It's a great point about the power of community to reinforce that. I love what you're saying too. We talk regularly here about how important it is to spend time with God, and we talk about, listening and prayer and scripture reading and all this. And that whole discipline of abiding, as you were talking, it reminds me of that passage Jesus said, you can clean the house out, but you got to put something back in it, because otherwise, all the bad stuff that was in there is going to come back times 10, basically, eventually. And I just hear you saying, hey, do all the stuff to get rid of the things you want to get rid of, but you've got to put something in its place that's healthy and good and life-giving. Is that a good way to summarize what you just said?
Yeah, I love that teaching of Jesus. There's another one similarly, and I want to say Ephesians. It's in one of Paul's epistles. I don't quite remember off the top of my head, but he talks to them about not stealing, and he says, "Don't steal." Yeah, and that's often how we treat porn. We say, "Don't look at porn. Stop." Yeah. Okay, and then he says, "But stop stealing and do something useful with your hands." And so for those that are watching on video, it's like I'm using my hands to steal. I'm stealing, and that's a heart thing, right? Like I think I'm objectifying really you as I steal from you because you don't matter to me. I want this stuff. I'm using my hands to steal, and then he says, use your hands instead to work. He literally says, work with your hands. So now I'm working, like I'm hitting a hammer or I'm building a chair. They're busy. Like my hands are busy. It's hard to go steal when I'm busy. And then he tops it off by saying, so that you can give to those in need. And now I'm using my hands to give. And it's really hard in my heart and with my actual hands to give and steal at the same time. Like those two things don't go together. So on that same point, I love that passage, and I love the one of Jesus as well, because it's not just about saying don't look at porn, and that's kind of like the purity culture thing of don't have sex, and it's like, okay, well what is good? Like what is good, and what has God made sex to be? And but with this, we talk about, instead of taking life, because objectifying is a way of taking life away. You're objectifying someone else for you're consuming them. You're eating the hamburger, throwing the trash away, and moving on to the next one. And there's many, many, many different ways that we can do that as singles and as married people. But that's taking life. What does it look like to give life? Like, what does it look like for me to see all women, or for a listener perhaps to see all men as people that are image bearers of God, people that are sons and daughters of God, people that are that are full humans, that are not sexual objects. And when I do that, I can start to become a safe person. I can start to have a safe church. I can start to give life by valuing all people and not just people that are attractive. I mean, there's subtle things like that we do, and you go, whoa, like that kind of has the same root as, I call it the porn mindset. And yeah, there is a whole change of heart that happens that's so far beyond just stopping. And when we do that, we're filling ourselves with the love of Jesus. And I say it's like eating Thanksgiving feast and then going to the grocery store. Like you're not hungry. You're not. The food isn't appealing to you. I mean, you're buying the things that you need versus going to the grocery store on an empty stomach. You're putting everything in your cart because you're starving, and every junk food on the shelf looks great. Yeah, absolutely.
Boy, that's a great point. That's a great metaphor too. And I hope that as people are hearing this, I just hope that we can hear. I think that when somebody faces a struggle, the immediate reaction is, I've got to stop the bad thing, in a sense. And your heart and mind is we want people ultimately to experience flourishing in Christ. And so, yes, it's saying no to some things, but I love your point. It's saying yes to other things that are life-giving. I'm curious, when you look at how men deal with this struggle as opposed to women, is there much of a difference between the two in terms of the nature of the struggle and, in a sense, the nature of how you treat it, or is it largely similar?
I think there's overlap, and I always want to be clear. I'm not an expert on women's struggles, and it's just partially because of the sensitivity of this subject. We're talking about some really sensitive sexual behaviors and things like that. So I would always refer women to, like I said, Crystal Renaud Day at SheRecovery.com is a great resource. Julie Slattery, Joyce Garka with her Freedom Journey, Authentic Intimacy, a great resource. From some of the things I've observed, though, the one stat about the 90, the one about the written, 90% of people, men and women, have consumed porn in the last month, right? And it says written, photo, or video. And in that research, they said that more women were looking or doing the written pornography than men. Like that was just one example from that exact research. So that's one thing we can talk about. And it doesn't mean, again, it doesn't mean all women are only looking at written porn,
Sure.
But that is something that's not talked about very much. Like, what is written porn? I mean, because I read some popular books and then go, whoa, I can't read that. And I know some of it's because of my issues, like some of it's because of my triggers, and perhaps, I don't know, perhaps some people can filter things. And I think there's books that are pornographic. I think there's some of these romance novels that are literally just written for that. But yeah, when is the last time you heard women kind of challenged or called out to that's porn? I mean, it is. It's doing the same thing to your mind and your fantasy life and objectifying and making you discontent with reality. So that's something that I just don't think gets talked about a lot. And then, beyond that, I think there's definitely differences. I mean, our bodies are different. I think even just the fantasy piece, the connection of porn and masturbation piece, and just there's a lot of different parts. But my exclusive experience is with counseling men on this, and so I just want to be a little careful to not say stuff that I don't know about women and their struggles. I just know the stats are getting really high, and I will just say, when we talk about it in church, we should always talk about it to men and women. Because if we only talk about it to men, it triples the stigma for women, because we're already talking about a stigmatized issue, and then a Christian woman goes, oh, I'm really messed up because they don't have anything for me. That's just for men. I'm struggling with a male sex issue. I'm beyond hope, right? And so I hear that consistently from women. So I'm doing better at that myself in these last few years, and just trying to always kind of keep that spreading in the church, that we address both.
A follow-up question that you also may feel like, hey, this isn't my expertise area, so you may not want to go all the way in on that, and I totally understand if that's the case, is and I'll say when a woman in particular hears about her husband being in a pattern of engagement with pornography that she was not aware of, and let's say it's pretty significant, what would you say to that woman at that time? Any words of advice, counsel?
Yeah, I can definitely go there because we deal with that type of stuff all the time in Beyond the Battle. So I think there's lots of different scenarios and context, but there's two that come to mind. One is, and I was going to actually bring this up because you mentioned, sharing with when you and your wife were dating, and she was very, forgiving and things like that. And I know very different context of kind of the timeline of when you shared and things. But I think in one setting, the guy initiates the conversation with the wife. The husband initiates it with the wife. And in those cases, this is a little bit different question, but I'll make sure I circle back. In those cases, I always encourage the guy to have a plan. Don't just be feeling guilty like you just looked at porn and now you feel like garbage. And now you're going to go tell your wife, hey, I'm struggling with porn. I looked at it this morning or last night and I'll never look at it again. That's not true. You will look at it again unless you have a plan because you're in an addictive cycle. And so have a plan and work the plan first. And if you can, get into a Beyond the Battle group, get into some type of vulnerable community, get the software, do something, start going to counseling, do something that shows your wife, like you actually mean it. You're not just saying you'll never do it again. And if you don't do anything about it, then those are just empty words. So that's a piece of it. In this scenario where the guy goes to the wife, and so back to your question, if you're the wife and the guy came to you and he's sharing this with you and it's pretty serious, one, I always want to be careful to say any dogmatic rules about this. There's something called betrayal trauma. It's real. There's a lot of resources out there. So women, look it up. Look up betrayal trauma, get help. In our settings, a lot of the guys are getting a lot of help, and they're changing, and they're becoming very different men. And their wives have a justified right to not trust them, and the justified right to not want to be intimate in any way, and especially not sexually. And so the guy starts to get frustrated, like, why am I doing this work? She's just getting like colder and icier, even though I'm changing. And the guy has to be patient and understand that she doesn't have a reason to jump in and trust. And we're talking about infidelity. Sometimes we're talking about porn, that she doesn't owe you anything. And so, but for women listening, and it could go the other way too, if it's a woman who's in the sexual sin. But there's a side for the one that was betrayed. There is some work to be done as well on, okay, when can I trust my spouse again? When have they showed that they're doing the work and they've done enough work, and what are the small steps to take? Like, we're not going to jump into bed and have sex, but what are some small steps of intimacy? There are couples and there are women out there that are experts in this to guide women through that. And I think it's really, really important. So, sorry, back to your question. The first scenario is if the guy initiates it to the wife, and if there's a gap of time, it wasn't just this morning, but there's some kind of gap of time where there's been this success and he's working at it and he's showing that like he really means it. I do hope that women are able to one, feel your emotion. I mean, you can be sad and cry and I mean, you were betrayed, and you don't have to change any of that. You don't have to protect your husband from your emotions. In fact, he needs to feel those emotions. Like the guy that's the addict, or perhaps the woman that's the addict, like we need to feel this is real. Like this is not a little theological debate we're having. This is not some small thing. This is real, and that's why my wife gets my Covenant Eyes reports and my Accountable to You reports, because I want the realness of consequences. I don't recommend that for everybody, but if you can do it, it's really good. The second scenario is, did the wife found this out, right? The wife caught the guy. That's really difficult. That is really, really difficult. And again, every marriage is different. Every man is different. Every woman is different. But I think in that setting, one, it's going to depend on the guy's reaction. It's going to depend on if he's open to help and healing. Perhaps he needed to get caught. Perhaps that was his turning point, and to give him the chance. I don't mean trust him right away. I don't mean, let's have makeup sex or something. Like, not at all. I think it is, and again, it could be infidelity. This is a thing where, you have to have consequences. You have to protect yourself. You have to protect your heart from being betrayed in the future. But give the guy a chance to be caught. Give him a chance to get help and see if he does. And again, there's great resources out there where you don't have to figure this out alone. But if the guy's caught and he's not willing to change, he's not willing to admit it's a problem, he minimizes it, you're going to have a lot bigger issues on your hand. And I'm not going to tell you on a podcast what to do, but I think at that point you got to talk real seriously with a counselor, a pastor, and most of the cases I deal with, because guy's coming to be on the battle, he wants help. He wants help. I'm not typically dealing with the guy that doesn't care, the guy that thinks that this is okay. I do think that's a different situation. So maybe if you have any follow-up to that, I know I kind of covered a lot, but that is a really sensitive question. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a great response too. Just, there is no one-size-fits-all kind of response based on the situation, but I think those are some great principles overall when it comes to response. I think it'd be cool to just land this conversation on a note of hope. And I know that for many guys and for women, at times the battle just feels hopeless. It feels like, man, this is so difficult. I feel like I'm taking steps. Maybe sometimes it feels 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. Again, my primary context is talking to guys about this issue. So same as you, I don't want to minimize women who are struggling, but I would say the primary conversations I've had around guys who are struggling, and then they themselves may feel discouraged by a lack of progress, and let's say their wife is also feeling like, oh my gosh, is this just going to be where we're stuck? So I would love for you to end with just a word of hope on if we engage in the kinds of things we've been talking about through this conversation. What have you seen? What's possible when it comes to freedom and wholeness? Do we have reason for hope when we take some of these steps?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's my favorite thing about doing this work. Number one, there is absolutely hope. You can stop looking at porn. If you can't do it on your own, that's the thing. But if you're willing to go down this journey, if you're willing to take these steps, get into one of these groups, start this process, you can absolutely be freed from porn. I've experienced it. I've seen time and time again where men and women have experienced that. The other piece of hope to this is I have seen, honestly, greater discipleship fruit in my Beyond the Battle groups that I have seen in 20 years of pastoral ministry. And it's not to say that there hasn't been discipleship fruit in pastoral ministry, but in these recovery settings, your discipleship is it's on fast forward. I mean, it's on like steroids, because you go in day one with weakness. You go in day one desperate for Jesus in vulnerability. And man, vulnerability is the key to our growth in Christ. That's for anybody, men, women. If you struggle with sexual sin or we all struggle with stuff. Be vulnerable. Find people you can be safe with and be vulnerable. So that's my other piece of hope, is you may be about to embark on a discipleship journey that is going to take you deeper into the love of Jesus than you have ever experienced before. And I've seen it time and time again. I've seen it in my own heart, in my own life, and that's beautiful. And lastly, for marriages, this isn't just about not looking at porn. This is about the heart issue, and I call it the porn mindset, but it affects every part of your marriage. It affects the way, for guys, that we objectify our wives, the way we use our wives for selfish reasons. And we have guys that have been married for 30 years, and they are, praise God, are learning the difference that sex and intimacy are not the same thing, and that they can cultivate intimacy with their wife that is not sexual, and it's beautiful, and they can see her as a whole person. And we do a whole thing on entitlement. We get rid of the entitlement that we have in our marriages, and it's amazing to hear a guy in his 60s who's been married 31 years, and to say the last year of our marriage, we've had the best sex we've ever had, and we've had the best marriage we've ever had. We've been closer than we've ever been. My wife loves me more than she ever has. I love her more than I ever have. This is the guy that for 30 years was a sex, whatever you want, fill in the blank, like addicted to porn or, whatever. Like the world's idea of gorging yourself on sex is a miserable sex life and a miserable marriage. And when we start to get to these root level changes, it changes everything. And man, I've seen it happen. I've seen it continue to happen. And it can happen to you as a listener. It can happen to your spouse. Be vulnerable, and Jesus will meet you there with his grace. And it'll happen. It'll continue to happen.
That's a great word, and it's great for people to hear just those illustrations of hope. I have a good friend, actually, who's a pastor in another state. I believe he founded the church that he was leading. It grew to be a monstrous church, and what nobody knew was he had a secret sex addiction that was leading to all kinds of brokenness in his personal life. Finally, he was found out. All of his leadership blew up. He was literally in the newspaper, the whole thing. And had to, of course, immediately was released from his position at his church, had to find a job that was very much kind of below his station, so to speak. Really had a big-time career journey after that, and obviously, and most significantly, had a huge journey back to gain the trust of his wife and get healthy internally. He did all the kinds of things we've been talking about, and I just asked him about what he would say about the quality of his marriage, having gone through all of this stuff, and he said, Brian, hands down, our marriage today, after and honestly because, and he wasn't saying it was good, he went through all this stuff, of course. He wasn't saying it was justified, anything like that. But it did force him to deal with things on the inside that would have gone unaddressed had all of this not blown up. And because of that, and because of some of the work that he and his wife did, he's like, hands down, we're in the best place of marriage that we have ever been.
Amen.
And I just think it's so cool to hear that. And I just echo everything you just shared, Noah. There is hope. It's not going to come like you just flip a switch or probably pray a quick prayer. If that works, boy, bless God for that. I know once in a while he does a great miracle. But for most of us, it's going to be a journey. It's going to be a commitment. Yeah. And so really, really, really appreciate everything that you shared today, Noah. Thanks for investing your life and vulnerability in the ministry you're doing. And I really hope and pray that as folks listen to this particular episode, they're able to take a step forward. Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, Brian, thanks for having me. Thanks for shining a light on this. Let's keep it up. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Noah. And I just want to say to you, if right now you are in a struggling place, please, please, please don't fight your battle alone. There is reason for hope. There are steps you can take to grow and to experience victory and freedom. But it is so very unlikely that will happen if you're just like trying to make this happen on your own. Get in community, get in places where you can be vulnerable with other people and really be transparent and get support for the journey that you're on. Once again, I want to say, if you have enjoyed this episode, please do rate and review us. That helps get the word out about Made to Advance. This has been a production of Engedi Church. We've got so many more great conversations on the way. So if you haven't subscribed yet to our podcast, please subscribe. But until next time, please know you were made to advance.